Welcome everyone to the ICNC webinar series. My name is Maciej Bartkowski. I'm Senior Advisor at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I'm delighted today to host Robyn Gulliver and Winnifred Lewis, our guest speakers. And today's webinar is titled Civil Resistance Against Climate Change, What is Happening and What Works. The webinar presentation will be based on their forthcoming ICNC monograph, co-written with Kelly Fielding, Civil Resistance Against Climate Change. And the monograph will be available in the coming weeks, and everyone will be able to download the free copy of that monograph from the ICNC website. And those who attend the webinar and register for this webinar will receive a link to that free copy once it's released by ICNC. I remember that we began working with Robyn, Winnifred, and Kelly around 2 years ago, and we quickly realized the potential for the research and what that research could produce in terms of findings. Firstly, there is really not much civil resistance scholarship centered around climate change resistance, and secondly, there is still little understanding of the role and impact civil resistance and grassroots organizing have or can have on slowing down, if not stopping, major perpetrators of the climate change. So this webinar and Robyn and Winnifred's presentation will highlight lessons learned from the Australian environmental movement for climate change, and these lessons learned could be very much applicable to campaigns around the world. And the talk will specifically look into the role civil resistance actions can play in successfully pressuring the drivers of climate change. And I would like to remind our audience that we are live tweeting from the ICNC Twitter at Civil Resistance, and people can share also their reactions using ICNC webinars hashtag. So now I will briefly introduce our speakers. Robyn Gulliver is a multi-award-winning environmentalist, writer, and researcher who has served as an organizer and leader of numerous environmental organizations. Born in New Zealand, she has spent the last decade advocating for and writing about environmental issues for activist groups, local councils, non-for-profit organizations, and academia. Winnifred Lewis is a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland. Her research interests focus on the influence of identity and norms on social decision-making. She has studied this broad topic in context from political activism to peace psychology to health and the environment. So now, without further ado, I would like to ask Robyn and Winnifred to take over from me and go ahead with the presentation and showing the findings. Robyn, Winnifred, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending today. My name is Robyn Gulliver.
And I'm Winnifred Lewis.
Winnifred and I are speaking to you from the Aboriginal lands of the Quandamooka, the Turrbal, and the Jagera people, now known as Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. We'd firstly, before we start, like to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the injustice of the lands we're on that were never ceded. We also thank the International Centre on Nonviolent Conflict for their support and enthusiasm for this project. Winnifred, myself, and our co-author, Professor Kelly Fielding, thank them so much for being so wonderful to work with. And finally, thank you also to everyone taking action to demand an urgent response to our climate crisis right now. From Germany to China to the US to Russia, we are all experiencing the effects of this crisis now. And this is our future, but it is a future that people are trying to change. And that is what we are going to talk about today. So in this presentation, we'll be talking through 4 issues. The first we're looking at is the Australian environmental movement in general. Then we'll look at climate change civil resistance within it. Third, we'll briefly cover findings from a case study before finishing with state responses to civil resistance. Now, before we get into the data, it's important to identify what we mean by the terms we're going to use. Firstly, we define activism as the use of direct and noticeable action to achieve a result, usually a political or a social one. In this study, we look at groups which engage in activism in Australia. Now, it doesn't include groups like bush care and cleanup groups or wildlife rescue groups. It does include groups that many of you have probably heard of, such as School Strike for Climate and Extinction Rebellion. And this latter group brings us to our next definition of civil resistance. Now, civil resistance can take roughly three forms: acts of commission, doing or creating, such as suckling swarms or creating alternative institutions. Acts of omission are not doing, which includes strikes and boycotts. And finally, acts of expression, saying, are actions such as rallies and Twitter storms. So let's move to our first topic. What does environmental activism look like in Australia? There are a couple of reasons why we start with the whole movement first. Now, environmental groups often focus on multiple environmental issues, of which climate change is just one, and civil resistance is just one form of activism used by groups. So looking at the movement as a whole means we don't miss out on much. So what are the characteristics of the environmental movement in Australia? This graph shows data collected from 497 environmental activism group websites on their group formation dates. Now, the earliest date we found was 1883 down there, which was a flora and fauna society in South Australia. By the 1970s, groups began forming around other issues such as sustainability in the grey colour. By the turn of the century, especially around 2006, there was a surge of groups focusing specifically on climate change. We also looked at what activities these groups do. This graph shows data acquired from scraping event listings off Facebook. In total, those 497 environmental activist groups had 728 Facebook pages, on which they promoted over 36,000 events between 2010 and 2019. Now, using a macro, we coded these events into 5 types: civil resistance, eco-activities like tree planting days, information sharing activities like public talks and film screenings, meetings and admin events such as annual general meetings, and social fundraising events like music concerts and trivia nights. Taking into account that the data also reflects the growth of Facebook as a promotion platform, what we can see is that the most common events promoted by groups are information sharing events in the grey. So that gives us a look at what the Australian environmental movement is doing. Winnifred will now talk a little bit more about groups in the broader global context.
Thanks, Robyn. I think a powerful metaphor that we're using to think about the relationship of these groups is that of a river delta. So if we think of the contemporary groups like Greenpeace and so on as the mouth of the river, the visible face, the energy pouring into the community, it's easy to forget that behind that present day action is this huge historical sweep of time. And so thinking about movements in other contexts, the US, the UK, the Global South, one of the things that really strikes us about this data is the potential for both scholars and activists to engage with the diversity or ecosystem of activist groups. So for an activist perspective, harnessing the energy of these older conservation groups in Australia is connecting with tens of thousands of people who are really likely to be sympathizers of the movement. In the American context, the Sierra Club, for example, has made that bridge between the conservation movement and the contemporary activism for climate change. But in many contexts, those groups can be divorced from each other and not coordinating very closely at all. And from a scholarly perspective, looking at the way that the historical groups and the emerging groups are working together has a lot to offer, a lot of interesting points we can address.
Thank you, Winnifred.
Over to you, Robyn. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Now we'll look at part 2, climate change, civil resistance within the Australian environmental movement. So this graph shows there's been a dramatic increase in the use of civil resistance tactics on climate change since 2010. Again, this data is from Facebook, so it mirrors increased social media usage, but the surge of action in 2019 is still really noticeable. What sort of civil resistance is being used? Well, the most common type of civil resistance actions that we found in our data set were acts of expression. In total, 61% of all civil resistance actions we found were acts of expression done by climate change groups. These were marches and human signs. Now, 50% of all of the actions were rallies. Following this, 13% of actions were acts of omissions held by climate groups. These included the school strikes, the walkouts, and the boycotts. And the least common type of action were acts of commission, such as die-ins and blockades. Climate groups held 282 of these, while other groups held 15. So looking at the actions in total, we can see that climate change groups really dominate the use of civil resistance in Australia. Here's some images of the most well-known examples of climate change civil resistance in Australia. On the left, a protester is locking onto a truck at a coal mine site in Queensland as part of the Stop Adani campaign. In the middle is a photo of the School Strike for Climate rally in September 2019. And on the right is an Extinction Rebellion protest in 2019, which generated a substantial police response here in Australia. Of course, climate change civil resistance gained headlines around the world in 2019 before the pandemic. Winnifred now will again put this into a global context for us.
Thanks, Robyn. Yeah, I think, again here, both for scholars and for activists, what this data suggests to us is the tremendous value of comparative work. So now with the opportunities provided by our own baseline data, from scholars, we would love to see comparative data coming through on the prevalence and the historical change of these forms of action in your local context. From a scholarly perspective, another unaddressed question is why certain forms of action would be more common and perhaps more effective in certain contexts than others. And that kind of research is going to benefit activists and organizers as well. We'll touch a little bit on that in our next section, but just to highlight, is there a sense where Extinction Rebellion, for example, was able to capitalize or leverage their actions to achieve more in certain countries like the UK compared to other countries like Australia? Can we better understand that dynamic? Back to you, Robyn.
Thank you, Winnifred. Now we're coming to case study, our section 3 on the case studies. We looked at the Stop Adani campaign as one of our case studies. And this case study helped us identify what climate change civil resistance is actually achieving. So the Stop Adani campaign seeks to stop the Adani Corporation from constructing a very large thermal coal mine in central Queensland. The campaign has been running for about 10 years. The coal mine is being built, but excluding the pandemic times, civil resistance has been used continuously since around 2016. The campaign targets Adani Corporation and all entities associated with the mine. It is a directed network campaign with around 120 local volunteer groups supported by a centralised group of staff. Now, one of the characteristics of the campaign is that it has multiple goals. The primary goal is to stop the mine, of course, but there are 3 other secondary goals: build the movement, stop the money, and shift the politics. In addition, the campaign has targeted almost any political or business entity supporting the mine. Most targets have been political, but large mining, consultancy, and subcontracting companies, banks, and businesses have also received attention from the campaign. Now, the campaign's used a variety of civil resistance tactics. The most common was a rally and human sign, but it is engaged in a long-running blockade and numerous boycotts. We can see how these tactics have changed over time on this graph. This graph shows the number of civil resistance actions and their targets over time. Around 2016, there was a big focus on banks with sit-ins, rallies, and other actions right across the country. All big 4 Australian banks have now committed to not funding the mine. In 2019, mining and engineering contractors such as ACOM, Downer, and GHD were targets, all of whom have also now committed to not funding the mine. So there's been multiple successes despite the fact the mine is continuing ahead. Funding has been much harder to get. Many companies won't work with Adani anymore, and taxpayer funding has been reduced significantly. More specifically, there has been a high rate of successes against specific secondary targets. As the table shows, of the 60 financial entities targeted by the campaign, 77% of them have stepped away from funding the mine. 25% of engineering and construction companies have done the same. As we mentioned earlier, over 120 groups have formed as part of the campaign, and it's also supported a lot of other Australian climate and anti-mining groups. Finally, the campaign has joined forces with Indian climate justice groups. For example, in 2020, a protest in India by the Youth Action to Stop Adani was supported as part of the mobilisation of 25 global environmental youth action groups against the mine. Winnifred, over to you for the international context.
That's right, Robyn, thank you. I think the Stop Adani movement is probably Australia's biggest climate resistance movement of the last 10 years, but comparable examples overseas exist in the pipeline protests in the US and Europe. And so from a scholar's perspective, this type of very large movement with many groups joining on and hundreds of thousands of actions taking part is very valuable to be able to consider the different aspects of the campaigns and what worked. And of course, as with our earlier comments, the question of what worked is of great interest to organizers and activists. So what we can see is that in the scholarship, a great deal of the focus is usually on the ultimate or distal goal of the campaign, for example, to stop Adani. But what we know both from activist experience and from organizers and scholars is that there are many steps along the way to achieve that ultimate goal. And what we're able to show you in this data, and particularly in that eye-catching yellow, is that some of the targets that are the levers, if you like, that we can pull as activists seem to be a bit easier in the Australian context than others. And there are many reasons for that we can discuss, but I think a more urgent or pressing question is what it looks like in the international context. Can we establish robust patterns that activists can use and that scholars can seek to understand, where certain targets of activism that are essential to the progress of certain actors can be more efficaciously targeted? And I think that's a question that I hope some in the audience will be interested to address as well. Go ahead, Robyn.
Thank you, Winnifred. You might notice as well, following on from what Winnifred was saying about targets, is that we don't have government in terms of the number of wins there. And so this brings us to our fourth and final section, which is how has the government responded to this campaign and other campaigns using civil resistance over the last decade? Let's look at that topic now. Now, attempts to repress protests have been a constant feature of state responses to civil resistance around the world. Right since civil resistance began to be used in Australia back in the 1960s during the anti-logging and forest protection campaigns, both state and federal governments have used a number of strategies to try and stop it. It's difficult to track state responses to protests, particularly perhaps because in democratic states where much of the repression happens through policy and legal mechanisms, and where it's difficult to directly link inquiries and investigations to actual civil resistance tactics. To try and map repressive responses to climate change civil resistance, we looked first at arrests. Arrests provide a useful proxy for civil resistance that uses disruptive tactics. So this graph shows arrests reported across the media in Australia related to climate change protests. The earliest record we could find was in May 2016. Now, it's also important to note that it's extremely difficult to get information on arrests in Australia. There is no centralised open database, and freedom of information requests are stalled, declined, or heavily redacted, and very expensive. So this is what we found from media reports. There were peaks of climate activism arrests corresponding to actions. In 2016, the break-free coal port blockade in New South Wales took place, after which the organisation 350.org charitable status was investigated. There was a surge of arrests after the Adani blockade camp was established in 2017. And then there was a big peak of arrests in 2019, which was a combination of Extinction Rebellion protests and some other coal and mining related activism. Now, while these arrests were happening, there was a significant increase in the number of new proposed laws that were introduced at different levels of government. These laws were brought in to restrict protests, and we've put some examples in the table on the right. In March 2017, the federal government amended native title laws. Now, this is important because native title holders have small power in Australia to restrict or at least influence mining operations. In this case, native title rights were extinguished or cancelled over the land proposed for the Adani coal mine. In Victoria, at around the same time, new laws restricting the use of masks at protests were proposed alongside extreme jail terms, which could be used against activists. A peak of climate activism in New South Wales near the end of 2018 prompted a range of investigations into environmental charities. These investigations sought to strip them of their charitable status, and a surge of arrests in mid to late 2019 prompted many responses, including at the local council level here in Brisbane. Brisbane City Council, my city council, attempted to ban Extinction Rebellion Group from using their library meeting rooms. So it'll be interesting to continue to track this data over 2021 post-pandemic to observe both the change in tactics and the corresponding change in responses to those tactics by the different levels of government. And of course, it is very, very interesting to look at this again from our local and international perspective. Over to you, Winnifred.
Thanks, Robyn. That's right. A comparative analysis, as with our earlier points, we think is urgently needed. And part of that comparative analysis needs to look at the use of open violence against environmental activists, not just by agents of the state, such as police, but by paid or mobilized citizens who are treated with impunity and not prosecuted for their violence. So we know that environmental defenders around the world have been assassinated or kidnapped. Their families have been threatened. So this type of response is usually studied by completely different scholars than that study collective action. And it's often outside the radar of mainstream activist groups within the global north. But we know that many of the world's largest reserves for carbon, the great Amazon forest, the Indonesian forest, Borneo, are being targeted by corporations and resisted by local activists who are then targeted by state repression or by corporate violence. And understanding that dynamic is very, very important. Turning away from violence towards the question of effectiveness versus repression, we don't know of comparative data in the American or European context that can speak to the question of which states and when, which actors, which levels of government, which political parties perhaps, are more likely to try to use state repression, the triggers for that repression, and the barriers to that repression. Because, of course, many attempts to roll back climate dissent have failed because they've been defended through legal means or through activist means. So again, we see this as an important topic for both activism and scholarship to address. Over to you, Robyn.
Thank you, Winnifred. Now, the final section of our monograph, we present a number of suggestions and take-home messages for different audiences who want to support increased climate civil resistance activism. These suggestions are based on what we found from our data. The first of these is for activists and organisers to build strong alliances between local grassroots groups, target opponents and their allies while using different and changing tactical approaches, and ensure campaign and goals clearly communicate the target and have an achievable goal. We've also mentioned how allies can help, namely through facilitating coalitions, raising awareness, brokering trust, and helping to pressure the targets, and also academics and researchers to compile and use and disseminate empirical data sets on the characteristics of environmental activism and its outcomes, to bring together different disciplines and levels of analysis, and to investigate the links between goals, outcomes, and actual environmental change, such as greenhouse gas emission reductions. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you all again very much for listening, and to ICNC for your support. And I just want to mention all of this information, data and materials will be available in the monograph, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your questions and discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. Thank you, Winnifred. That was great. Quite a lot of useful information in terms of both the civil resistance kind of organizing and also for future research. I wanted first to remind people how they can ask the questions. So they can either raise their hand and indicate to us that they would like to ask the question live, and then I will unmute you and I will ask you to introduce yourself, and then you can go ahead and ask your question. Another way, if someone is too shy to ask the questions live, there is also an option to type the question into the question box, and then we will review the question and we'll ask that question to our speakers. So when you are taking right now your time and thinking about the question, I would like to ask our speakers two things. First, on one of the slides you mentioned one of the tactics, which was school strike, which caught my attention, and I wanted to ask you whether you could maybe elaborate more on the demographics of that resistance. We know that in the context of the kind of climate change, specifically the kind of younger generation is very much mobilized, and I wanted to see, to what extent you saw that also in your research. And then also, if you can maybe say a few more words about the school strike itself, how it was organized, against what exactly, and what what kind of mobilization you saw there, because I think a school strike it's a unique type of tactic, and I wanted to ask you to elaborate more on the context and maybe on the role and impact. And my second question is about exactly the table that you brought up to show how successful civil resistance was in targeting different industry. And I noticed there that despite the fact that there were even more civil resistance actions against kind of construction and insurance sector than finance, still there was much more successful with kind of pressuring the finance industry in the context of the campaign that you covered. And I wonder whether you could maybe a bit more elaborate why it was the case that there were so many more actions. There were more actions basically to target construction and insurance than finance, and still finance was much more amenable to pressure. But if you can focus your answer mainly on the kind of civil resistance aspect rather than maybe the target itself, unless it's kind of relevant to your kind of reflection on the kind of civil resistance organizing and civil resistance tactics to pressure those both industries, and then kind of clarify why you think it's there was so many more actions against construction and insurance, and still there was more kind of winnable outcome on targeting the financing sector rather than construction. So you can go ahead and maybe address my question, and then we will check on the questions from our audience.
Okay, I can answer the question on the school strike. As part of some of my work or volunteer work for groups, we did a very big survey on the school strike for organisers and participants. Now, there was apparently in the pre-pandemic strike, because there have been many school strikes, maybe 5 or 6 across the last 2 years in Australia. The pre-pandemic ones, I think the turnout was around 300,000 people, and there would have been an even spread of demographics in terms of attendees, adults and children. In terms of, and students, of course. In terms of organising, this is where it gets complicated. So a number of groups in Australia supported the school strike teams to learn how to organise and practice promotion and getting approvals and working as a team in their groups. And I do know from a survey results we got, there was often a challenging dynamic between the older activists who have been around for a long time doing lots of things, helping the younger ones. And I find that dynamic really, really interesting, and it has its challenges. What worked was that the younger people were given, took the lead. So they took the lead on creating the strike, and they did a really, really amazing job in Australia. And then the pandemic hit. And I think we can't really overstate how much the pandemic led to a loss of momentum in terms of what those younger people had built up with their new groups and their new networks, and trying to keep those networks together over the last 18 months has been very challenging for them. Winnifred, did you have anything to add to the school strike comment?
Yeah, just on the question of the demographics of the broader movement, you're right, Maciej, that young people often are involved, but also older people are disproportionately represented compared to the middle age. So that has to do with some of the opportunities that people have in terms of time, but also different political ideologies of the young and the mobilization opportunities that they have. I also want to comment that from our perspective, what we found is that broadening the demographics is a very useful path to effectiveness, and that a key to that, as Robyn just said, is allowing the demographic, whether it be youth or people of a particular ethnic group or people from a region or conservative people who have not yet been targeted, allowing those groups to take a leadership role in forming their expression of the movement is so important, rather than trying to parachute in with a movement designed by other demographics. Robyn, did you want to talk about Maciej's question about why there's so many movement failures against construction and insurance? From my perspective, the one sentence answer, Maciej, is that once the movement succeeded, they stopped being targets, but the more intransigent ones that weren't being effectively moved were targeted again and again. So it's almost like failure increases the targeting, at least in the short term, because people are trying to break through. But there's also a temporal aspect, because if you're still associated with Adani in 2019, after all of this activism, you're probably not in tune with the broader Australian community. So they were more tone deaf than the banks. Robyn, what else would you like to add there?
So I would like to say that some targets are more movable than others. Construction targets are just very difficult because they enter into contracts often well before activists find out that they have an association with the mine. And once those contracts are in place, they often use that, or legitimately or not, to say they can't get out of it. The other aspect I would point out is the randomness of it. So many banks and insurance and finance corporations in Australia are international. And just three good examples I can give you. One of our major 4 banks is Westpac. And there were some very, very entertaining civil resistance actions used against Westpac, one of which was on their 200th birthday celebration. Some activists kind of hung off the rafters in a very nice town hall and interrupted their celebration. And that was a really effective action. Westpac sort of committed to not funding the mine. Now, the second example that I was involved in as well, as a group here, is that a number of Chinese banks were going to support the mine. All it took was 1 or 2 media releases, and those Chinese banks immediately stepped back from funding the mine. So they just stopped straight away. But HSBC, which is again an international bank, they are still being targeted years on. So it's really a complex, very complex mix, not only within certain sectors of like construction, insurance and finance, but within those sectors as well. Some targets will move a lot quicker than others. What we need is the momentum. We need the majority of those targets within that sector to move and change the norms, and then others go after that.
Great. Thank you for those responses. Now I'm looking into the question list, and I have a question that came from Charles DiSalvo, and he wrote, "Thank you for your excellent presentation. Near the end of your presentation, you mentioned achievable goals. Can you please elaborate on this point? What makes a goal achievable? How can a movement identify what goals are achievable? And feel free to go beyond your case study if you would like to illustrate, that your response to that question.
I can definitely respond to that one. I have a lot to say on that one. Outside of this particular study and case study, we have done some work on compiling all of the goals that are stated on the websites of those environmental groups in our study population. So in 2017, we found 960 campaigns, environmental campaigns, and we went through and we looked for the goal of every single one of those campaigns. So it's a little bit hard to imagine unless you've looked at it, but a number of campaigns don't actually state what their goal is. So they'll say, we've got a goal, we want to, we've got a campaign about climate change. There's no goal, so you can't tell. This is a minority, but that's the first one. The next thing you can have is where you have a goal that is so broad. It's so broad that it's optimistic, it's just never going to happen. And an example of that is that we would like to stop climate change. And then you've got sort of intermediate ones. You've often got goals that you can't measure. So this is what happens frequently with campaigns that target private personal behaviours, such as reducing plastic consumption. You can't measure that goal. If your goal of your campaign is to get everybody in my suburb in Brisbane to use 15% less plastic in their lifetime, we're never going to be able to measure that. So that's also debatable if it's achievable. And then at the end, you've got the goals which are very targeted. Examples of this are the Climate and Health Alliance had a campaign to bring in a bill, I think in the New South Wales Parliament, that would align climate action with health impacts. And it was a very clearly stated, drafted strategy that they wanted to get through Parliament, and that was the goal. Other goals are, for example, to raise $5,000 to install solar panels on the local childcare centre. Measurable, achievable, and understandable for people to join the campaign and engage in. Winnifred, do you have more comments on that?
Yes, we did also recently release a paper called The Psychology of Effective Activism that talks about some useful steps you can take as an organizer to make your goals concrete. So one of them is to identify simply what target is this about. We identified, for example, it could be a campaign could be about the self, take pictures on social media, has some self benefits perhaps, or it could be about mobilizing other supporters, eliciting donations. It could be about targeting opponents or third parties and bystanders. So that is actually very helpful because then you can start to think about what kinds of tactics would these different groups respond to, because there may be different benefits for different audiences of different tactics. We also thought it's important to think about short, medium, and long-term goals. So of course, we all have a long-term goal of reducing climate change. But as Robyn highlighted, that may not be a concrete goal that you can target effectively with measures. So what are your short-term and medium-term goals? How will we get there? Elaborate your theory of change and then choose tactics that will allow you to progress milestone by milestone down that path. And last, in our piece, we identified that you could think about this as having a number of different outcomes for every policy change, that you would need to, for example, raise awareness, build sympathy, generate intentions to act, make sure that those intentions are implemented in actual action, grow the coalition, avoid counter-mobilization, and sustain your organization's actions over time. So we can think about, for each of the campaigns that you're running, are you targeting one aspect of that more than others? And a general rule, as you know, as I'm sure Charles and many people listening know, is that if you try to do everything, you achieve less than if you try to focus and take it step by step.
Thank you. There is a follow-up quick question from Valentina of Maciej. She's kind of asking about they were and what were the clear and achievable goals in the context of school strike. If you can, briefly maybe address that.
Yes. So school strike does have three goals on their website. One of them is to, forgive me if I've got this slightly wrong, but it's I think it's the introduction of a net zero emissions target by 2040 in Australia, something like that. So they have three clear goals. But the school strike is a good example of where it's often challenging for groups to show that they have goals. So in a campaign like Stop Adani, if you're in Australia, the campaign name is very clear and it tells you the goal and it tells you the target, and it's only two words, great, Stop Adani. Whereas School Strike for Climate, if I was interested and I wanted to know the goal, I have to go to the website and have a look and read it. And that's often one step too far for people. So you do often hear criticism of a number of groups saying, well, they just want action on climate change. And there's this, what are we supposed to do? We need to make it more tangible. But actually these groups do frequently do that. Extinction Rebellion is another example. They have in Australia 4 clear goals, but you have to put the time in to go and find them. And that makes it difficult, just following on from what Winnifred said, makes it difficult for people to know whether they feel like they align with the group, and it makes it difficult for the group to communicate. They can't spend all this time telling people their 3 goals. They have to focus on building supporters, getting new volunteers, strengthening new groups. Winnifred?
That's right, Robyn. I think that's a cogent analysis. And I would only add that in some cases, that idea of short, medium, and long-term goals means that the very clear long-term goal of persuading politicians in Australia to take action has a number of perhaps fuzzier short and medium-term goals around social license, around the idea of norm change, around highlighting, in this case with the school strikes, the fact that the older generation has a climate injustice obligation to address the younger people, and the actions that the older generations are taking now are going to burden the younger generation in a way that's unfair. And so that is a lens of climate injustice, generational climate injustice, that I actually think has a lot of potential to grow the movement in the longer term. So that's something specifically relevant to that particular school strike action.
I can also just briefly mention, I did some media analysis on the media coverage of School Strike for Climate and Extinction Rebellion. And so here in Australia, climate change is highly politicized and very polarized. And so that came through strongly in the media analysis. The School Strike for Climate, media weren't necessarily interested in the goals, but they had very positive coverage. So they were talking about the youth empowerment, youth action, stories, great stories about very young children building a group and doing something exciting down in Canberra, for example. The coverage on Extinction Rebellion was very, very negative. It traded in multiple negative stereotypes, and it generally focused on police and arrests. And so not only do we see that the school strike aimed to achieve these 3 goals, if you knew what those goals were, they actually had a really interesting power to change the narrative in the media in Australia and reach people in a way that perhaps Extinction Rebellion, given that coverage, couldn't do. And that was an outcome that was probably quite unexpected and not planned, but very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. When we think about those 7 goals of, building sympathy and raising awareness and avoiding counter-mobilization, growing coalitions, we can see that the different actions by different groups might have a different profile of outcomes across those distributions. And I guess one of the things that we are hoping that scholars and activists will engage around the world is if we can work out systematically what are the effective actions for growing coalitions, what are the effective actions for translating implementation of your vague intentions or willingness to act to concrete steps that decision makers and bystanders are taking that will make a real difference to climate change.
Yes, thank you. Definitely, if I think generally, parents and even politicians are encouraging youth to kind of voice, to take the stand, to be empowered, and I think that the kind of young people, particularly the kind of elementary, maybe middle school, they are viewed as very sympathetic audience, and if they take things in their own hands, it's difficult then to attack them for doing oftentimes what they are encouraged or expected from others to do. And so that's, I think, the role of the kind of sympathetic groups taking on actions is even, I think, more important, particularly when you outline or highlighted the repressive measures that the target or the opponent is taking, and definitely using those repressions against young people or even children would be, kind of difficult to contemplate. And then even if they are used, they have much greater potential to backfire. So good. I am right now looking at other questions. So there is one from Jim Riker. He's asking, what insights emerged from the Adani campaign about transnational activism by linking activists in Australia and India?
The first insight that springs to mind is how difficult it is. I think it's very, very important. So in Australia, a lot of, I'm not sure about the proportion, but certainly some of the funding comes from international sources, and there are increasing networks through organisations such as Sunrise Project, and of course, originally transnational organisations such as 350.org and Greenpeace, who have maintained that work over time. But these large transnational organisations tend to be, in my opinion, more vulnerable to repression in terms of loss of their charitable status. So both Greenpeace went through a very long court case in New Zealand on their taking their charitable status, and 350.org here as well. And so that does make it a little bit harder for them to engage in civil resistance actions. In terms of for the Stop Adani campaign, when the campaign first started, the first 5 or 6 years, it was quite small. So I mentioned in the slides that it's a directed network campaign. So that means you've got lots of local groups. These groups can emerge and evolve under whatever identities sort of they'd like to do in regions or cities, and they're supported by the centralised group, which has paid staff, and those paid staff are funded by various organisations, and they support those local groups. So it took about 6 or 7 years to build that structure and to get that funding for that centralised group. It wasn't until after that that connections could be more strongly formed with groups in India. And of course, Indian groups have been fighting Adani for a long time. It's not just about coal, it's about what Adani Corporation and other corporations have done in terms of their stripping of forests, their removal, just wholesale removal of people off Indian land. And so it's now, in the last 2 years, I would say those networks are building stronger. There was a very big roadshow here in Australia where a number of Indian speakers spoke about their actual experience with Adani and how Australians and Australian groups can help. I think it's really positive, it's really exciting, and the groups are trying to collect learnings that other campaigns could use if they reach the size of the Adani campaign, because this is one of Australia's biggest campaigns, but it's still very much a work in progress. It takes time and effort to maintain those links. Winnifred?
Yeah, I really agree. And I think I would add to that what I know Jim Riker knows from his own research, that there are special pitfalls and issues of concern. We know that transnational activism is important because it's a frequent target of repression, not just in terms of taking away charitable status, but even to the level that certain countries will ban certain groups, as Indonesia recently did. targeting big environmental organizations and prohibiting them from acting in the country. So that we kind of know that it's working because they're fighting it. But we also have seen in so many contexts that there can be a colonial mentality, a failure to listen to local partners, a failure to respect the autonomy and the vision and the energy of local partners, and of course, most concerning, a lack of follow-through when the local partners are targeted with arrest or murder. So I do think that a sustained commitment in the form of a decentralized network, a directed network like what Robyn says, where the local groups are supported, respected, given autonomy, and amplified in their messaging, rather than being directed as if they're only local pawns of a big struggle, which is being directed by the mastermind in the global north. I think that when there's a combination of grassroots energy with the support from overseas, the amplification of their voice, the support against repression, then that's a very powerful voice for change and push for change.
Groups like Climate Action Network across global groups are very good, I think, at facilitating this, because as Winnifred said, there is a challenging dynamic, and not only with transnational activism, but even in Australia, about how groups engage with other identity groups, whether they're particularly Indigenous rights groups, and how allies can be good allies without being dominant. And that is just a challenge. I think it's interesting, just final point, is that the Stop Adani campaign and others like it, in my opinion, have been really, really powerful because they do have a central core of paid staff, and those paid staff can put 40 hours a week into this work, whereas campaigns that entirely depend on volunteers not only struggle to actually maintain links and engage with other groups in their own communities, let alone overseas. You just get people, just coming in, coming out, and the volunteers can't sustain that over time, let alone do it in a really, really positive and meaningful and supportive way. So I can't find the solution yet, but whether the paid staff are there and perhaps things become a bit top down, or if you have volunteers and it becomes bottom up but not sustained. But I do think that international networks such as Climate Action Network and equivalent ones are doing really, really outstanding work facilitating this.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know Bruce has a question, so I will call on him right now. Bruce, you can go ahead.
Yeah, an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. There's I have one of your charts that's stuck in my mind, looking at the effectiveness rate of various tactics based on what the targets are. And the first thing that jumps off is the remarkable 77% effectiveness rate for financial institutions. That's a remarkable finding, and I think that in and of itself is a huge takeaway lesson for activists. But where my mind is drawn is farther down the list. If I remember it correctly, it said that coal haulage had a 33% effectiveness rate, and there were only maybe 3 or 4 targets, 3 or 4 actions. So that seems like quite a significant effectiveness rate for not having done very much. And it sort of leaves the question, where are the other actions that are following up on that? Is it that there are not a lot of targets? Were those previous actions long-lived actions that didn't reach their goal, and that was the chance that they had? And so I understand that's hyper-specific, but I think it creates the opportunity to look at the interplay between tactical choice and target, and how activists are making their decisions in which channels they continue to pursue.
Yes, that is a really good point. I'm glad you saw that statistic, because it's both a conundrum of statistics and a conundrum of activism. Now, there were only 3 coal haulage companies that put the bids in, so far as I know, for Adani, and one of them just declined very quickly. And I think, to be honest, there were other reasons for it. Might have been an American company, but still, they had some actions against them, and they said, okay, we won't work on it. the company that is working on it, there's been actions against them for years. And in a way, the statistical problem is that it's hard to say whether these actions are part of the Adani campaign or the broader actions against coal in Australia. So this railway company, it's Australia's main railway company, I think 80% of their business is coal haulage anyway. So there are many other groups trying to take action against this company to get them out of coal completely, not just Adani. Those actions, for example, include blockading their AGMs or asking shareholder activist questions, things like that. It's just because there were only 3 companies that we got this great success rate, but really that data hides a lot of the easiness of some wins and just the ongoing challenge of other wins. Winnifred?
Yeah, I would also add that sometimes you realize that this target needs to occur by targeting a different target. So with a lot of the coal-related industries, what we need to do, I think a lot of activists have pivoted, we need to support a just transition. So similar to what we've seen in a country like Germany, where there is a plan where these industries are going to find an alternative source of income. Because we can't just say to a coal haulage company, stop hauling coal. What are they supposed to do? So we need to support a just transition. And so it might look like people have stopped targeting those coal haulage groups directly, and they are still being targeted. But the reality is there's also growing attention to pressuring policymakers to show leadership, understanding that the global trend is that the coal industry is very important to Australia historically, but in the future we can see a time when it's going to end. So can we get a plan for those workers, for those companies, to see it just transition to a new economic model? And so the question of how the campaign is targeted can be a bit misleading if you simply say there's just one target.
Yeah, and it's been interesting watching how this evolves over time because that very same thinking process happens in all the groups I've been involved in. So first of all, it's like, okay, we want to stop Adani, so we're going to do this particular action against Adani. But actually we need to stop this coal company, so we do the action against the coal company. But actually the coal company is supported by our local politicians or say federal government. We need to target federal government. Federal government in Australia is immovable. So therefore we should target our state. You know, it's a kind of endless process. And where I've been excited, most of all recently, is that through that process, a number of groups have decided to target, if you want to call it targeting, they've decided to support independent MPs for the next state and federal elections in their electorates where known climate deniers are. So we have like 5 or 6 climate deniers in Parliament that obstruct everything. And that then flows down the chain, and that's why coal haulage companies can't find other industries or are unwilling to find other just transitions to engage in. So that's kind of this end point of evolution where these groups are actually working on independent MPs and have had some wins that then flow right down through our system. And maybe that's the only way we're going to get fossil fuels out of Australia, perhaps.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robyn. Thank you, Winnifred. So we are coming to the end of our webinar, and I would like to thank you so much for your presentation, for your excellent responses to the questions. And before we finish, and before I will ask you to say your kind of takeaway thought and concluding idea, I wanted to only say to the audience that this is our last webinar before the kind of summer vacation begins in August for us, and but we will have a couple of webinars that we are lining up for this fall, starting from September. So we'll encourage you to tune in and to also sign up for our list server on ICNC website. And so Robyn, Winnifred, please go ahead with your concluding thought.
Okay. Just my concluding thoughts. I'd like everybody to thank everybody for coming along, and I hope you enjoyed the monograph when that's out as well. my great dream is that we will have more and more people, not only, of course, doing climate activism, but actually getting data on it to see what works. And that is the only way we're going to be able to find out what we can do better, quicker, right now, and address this crisis, this terrible crisis. Winnifred?
That's right, Robyn. I totally endorse that. That's my key takeaway as well. And I want to also let our audience know that Robyn's had 2 other books published in the last 6 weeks. So one's on women in the environmental movement in Australia, and the other is our monograph on the psychology of effective activism. So if you can't get enough Gulliver, you can read those and other papers. But I do think that the momentum for comparative work to see what the soft targets are and what levers we can pull to achieve action in different contexts more quickly, particularly in the global south, but also on specific hard-to-move industries like coal in Australia. This is where there's going to be a lot of exciting bang for the buck. So I hope that researchers and activists will start to look at that question.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. I just want to remind the audience that we have recorded that webinar, and that webinar will be available on ICNC website. We'll send the link to the webinar to everyone who registered for it. And then in the probably by the end of this month or the beginning of August, we will have the monograph ready, and we will be sending a note to everyone who registered for that webinar. It will be accessible in PDF format for free to those who will be interested, and we will be sharing that also on social media. So please also stay tuned about that. So once again, Robyn, Winnifred, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you a very good day. I know that you started early at before 6 a.m., I guess 5:30 even a.m. So I hope you will have a great day, and you will have also a chance to take a good rest. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.